For more on the findings of this internal CIA report, we're joined from the U.S. state of Idaho by Stephen Yates. He's CEO of DC International Advisory. That's a firm that helps clients manage political risks. And Phyllis Bennis is here in our DC studio. She directs the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Why don't I start with you, Phyllis? You just heard that report. I guess if the CIA is looking at the Mujahideen as a success story, given the fact that they morphed into al-Qaeda, it doesn't look like this is all that successful, this strategy, is it?
Yeah, this was one of those, really, that's the best you can come up with kind of moments looking at the CIA report as it was reported in the New York Times. It is rather shocking that the only one that they could come up with is Afghanistan in the 1980s during the opposition to the Soviet Union, when the US sent in massive amounts of arms, Pakistani ground troops, and US trainers. The CIA was in there. And what happened was we got al-Qaeda and we got 9/11. So the notion of seeing that as some great success is pretty shocking.
Stephen, I want to get your thoughts. Is this an accurate assessment, do you think?
Well, this sounds to me to be one of the National Intelligence Council estimates. We get periodically in the White House and other agencies these kinds of reports that come from kind of the academic, analytical, and speculative department within the agency, not usually the line analysts who would acknowledge that intelligence pictures often are not complete enough to be determinative. So you end up with a meeting document that tends to meet with what has been asked at the table in the Situation Room. And if they sense that there was reluctance around the Situation Room, especially from the president, a lot of times estimates can lean that way when it comes from this academic wing of the agency. Also, over my time in government, seen estimates that vary widely in their conclusions within a couple of years of each other. And so I strongly suspect this is that kind of document.
But
I think it's a bad idea to rely on covert action alone.
Let me ask you this then. Would you think arming rebels is a good strategy?
Well, it could be if it's part of a broader strategy. I think it's a bad idea to think of covert action and just arming groups in isolation. And I think if we have a legitimate threat where intervention is necessary, you'd have to think of a lot of other factors that could determine whether this is a success or advisable or not. Intervening in the Syrian civil war 3 years ago is a very different prospect than intervening now. Intervening in arming people in Iraq would have been a very different prospect had we not left, but we did. And so coming back now is a very different level of risk. So there's lots of things that go into whether these kinds of operations could succeed or have a chance.
Phyllis, I know you want to jump in.
Well, I just think that what we're looking at here, according to the New York Times, is that this was a report looking back. This wasn't an operational set of proposals. This was looking back and saying, give me examples of where arming rebel troops worked. And the best they could come up with was Afghanistan, where the troops that we armed created al-Qaeda. So I think it's pretty clear that the CIA itself is saying, and this wasn't an NIE, this wasn't the National Intelligence Council, this was the CIA's own report, and they said basically no, that it hasn't worked if the best they could come up with was al-Qaeda. I think that what we're looking at here is the consequence of US intervention over and over again in the region. You know, the notion that somehow all the problems began in Iraq when the US pulled out begs the notion that we occupied that country for 8 years. We built a military, we built a police operation there, we created political parties that were explicitly based on sectarian divides, and then we're surprised that when eventually most of the troops pull out, that the country doesn't survive the way we want it to.
Well, and Stephen, let's kind of riff off that for just a minute or two. I mean, the Iraqi forces did melt away. A lot of their weapons ended up in the hands of ISIL, now being used against not just the Iraqi government, but Syria, one would suspect.
And those are our weapons. Those aren't ones they just got from anywhere.
Weapons.
They're US weapons.
I'm sorry, was that a question to me?
It was.
Okay.
It does get tricky, though, doesn't it?
I think there are two things that are important factors in this. Of course, situations change based on how we enter and how we exit and what's happened in between. The Mujahideen example was one where things changed dramatically after we left. And even the advocates of that intervention, which didn't come from the right for the most part, were people who sacrificed a lot. And then when we left, it's when those pieces got picked up. And when you leave things behind, of course, bad people will get them. Similar things happen in Iraq when a lot of material goes in. and there's a withdrawal, and there's things around. Of course, the most powerful or violent group gets those things. So there's consequences of intervention. There's also consequences of withdrawal. I think it's general. It's bad idea, bad policy to intervene without contemplating the withdrawal. It's also bad policy to withdraw, leaving dangerous things behind. Easy to say in retrospect, but there is no evidence whatsoever in the New York Times report what the source of this intelligence is. And if there is, you're open to a leak investigation.
I think that we're also looking at a situation where this isn't only about Afghanistan. We're also looking, if we're going to look at where the weapons are coming from now, the weapons that ISIS is taking hold of in so many places, we have to look at Libya. We have to look at the results of the intervention there, which was not about arming local troops very much. That came later. But the US-NATO airstrikes that led to the immediate overturning of a government, the killing of Gaddafi, and left the government in non-existent, essentially, left the country in shambles, and left the doors unlocked to the weapons stockpiles that are now being seen all over the region, as far afield as Mali and in Africa, and throughout all of the Middle Eastern countries that are facing these new, very dangerous struggles around Islamism and the others, whether it's Syria, whether it's Iraq, Yemen. We're seeing the influx, Egypt, the influx of weapons directly from Libya that stems directly from the US and NATO intervention.
Stephen, you mentioned arming the rebels as part of a broader strategy. What would you think would be an effective strategy in terms of taking on ISIL and being successful?
Well, it's easy to say, given where we are now, that there are lots of options that weren't taken that may have made a difference. If we had been monitoring the geographies at the Iraq-Syria border, and we had taken seriously the growth of this Islamic State movement coming out of Syria, we might have seen some of these significant movements. And if we had been so inclined at the time with satellite imagery, we could have taken some hits at those movements before they had occupied significant swaths of land in Iraq. That would have been an option. We can't know because we didn't take it, and it might not have been advisable, and we don't have complete information now. But the idea that we're going to make a meaningful difference on the ground, either with covert action alone or airstrikes alone or other kinds of tools alone, just isn't very realistic. We'd need to have a comprehensive approach with allies and a political objective and a whole host of things. And it's hard to succeed in any of those anyway. But what we didn't do in this case was respond promptly, early, and effectively to thwart the growth of the threat. So now we have a full manifestation right now with significant territory occupied, well-funded group. It's going to be extremely difficult to change its general trajectory right now.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but thank you both for joining us. Certainly appreciate it.